Many of you have tried to learn a foreign language. How many of you can speak 2 or 3 words in something other than English? How many of you have a hard time with English? Okay. Many of you have tried. We have the youngsmans who are wonderful with English and even better with Dutch. I can't speak a single word of Dutch. I think that I can handle myself for 2 or 3 seconds in Spanish, and that's really exciting, but that's about it. But I remember I spent a month in Barcelona. In 1992, I was a summer missionary to Barcelona, Spain. The Olympics were there. An amazing month. And I was there with about 30 other college students. And we all had varying levels of Spanish proficiency. At that point in college, I'd had a year of Spanish. I had 3 years in high school. And so my Spanish was pretty good. There was a member of our team named Linda who had had 4 years in high school and 4 years in college. She was great. And so she became kind of the go-to girl. We had several translators, but if we couldn't find any of them, Linda was the girl. Well, one Sunday, Linda was sick. And so they needed a translator for the worship service. Guess who was next in line? Yours truly. I've never prayed for healing so hard as I prayed that day. Because I had been there about 2 weeks. And I had been amazed at being in worship with these Spanish brothers and sisters. And they did the entire service in Spanish. And Linda would stand there and give us sort of a summary of what was being said because it was breakneck speed. If you think I preach fast, you should have heard this brother preach in Spanish. It was lightning fast. But she was doing great. And I had been amazed at how just in 2 weeks of being in this Spanish country and being in this Spanish-speaking city and hearing it everywhere I went, how much more I was picking up. The Spanish had been there all along. It was finally soaking in because I didn't have a choice. Jesus is saying as the kingdom immerses around you, as you are immersed in the kingdom, it will start making more sense. But you have to come into the kingdom first. You have to follow, and then you'll understand. There's some of you that say, I'll follow Jesus when I get my life straightened out. Or when I have a better understanding of the Bible and what God wants, then I'll give Him more of my time. And Jesus says that's not how it works at all. You accept the kingdom, the seed, and then the fruit comes. But you accept it knowing that there are other things that will come around you, the worries of the world and the deceitfulness of riches and the persecution caused by the word, and you still produce fruit. He says that is the way of faithfulness, and I want people who are willing to push away anything and to go through anything in order to follow me. That's what he said in verse 16. Blessed are your eyes because they see and your ears because they hear. For truly I say to you that many prophets and righteous men desired to see what you see and did not see it, and hear what you hear and didn't hear it. They were in it. They were in the kingdom. They had heard over and over, but they didn't let it soak in. They were hard. There were many on our team that summer who knew no Spanish when they arrived and knew no Spanish when they left. But it was fascinating to watch. There were several from a community college in Mississippi, down on the Mississippi Delta, as country as you can get, but who fell in love with these people at this church in Barcelona and who in those 4 short weeks began to be able to speak words and even sentences. They had been changed because they let it soak in. Jesus says the kingdom is here, and it is like yeast that makes dough rise. It is like a mustard seed that can grow into something huge. It is like this net that involves good and bad, and God will sort them out. It is like this banquet to which you have been invited, but you have to have the righteousness of Jesus, not your own good works. He says the kingdom is like the laborers who've been called to the vineyard, and the one who owns it can pay them whatever he has agreed to pay them. And it is an equal wage, and it is fair, but it is available to all who are invited. He says that's what the kingdom is like. And so what does it look like when you are involved? It is that you are receptive, that you are changed, and you are willing to go through the hard work of understanding, of walking with Him, of listening, of seeing. But then in Matthew 18, He gives us one more description. As I said in Galatians chapter 5, there is this great picture of what the working of the Spirit in your life looks like. And as Jesus describes the kingdom, He says there's going to be fruit in your life that's going to change you, and there's going to be a faithfulness, a hunger to follow after Him. But in Matthew 18, he gives us one more thing I want us to see today. Look in verse 21. Matthew 18, verse 21. Peter came to him and said, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? Jesus said, I don't say to you up to 7 times, but up to 77 times. Or your translation may say 70 times 7 or 77 times. The Greek is a bit unusual, but what Jesus is saying is it's not just 7, it's a multitude of times. And Peter probably thought he was being pretty nice, because Jewish tradition was that you forgave people 3 times. Some would say rabbinical tradition would even say 4, but Peter is moving to twice as much. He's saying, should I forgive him 7 times? And Jesus says, no, you multiply the forgiveness. Up to 70 times 7 or 77 times. It's unlimited. That in the kingdom, it's unlimited. And he describes it, verse 23. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. And when he'd begun to settle them, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. 1 talent was 6,000 days' wages. 1 talent. And so there's 10,000 talents. And so this would be roughly equivalent today at a day's wage of about $7.50 an hour. This would be about $3.5 billion. That's the size of the debt. Just so you can get in your mind. In today's numbers, for this audience, when he said that he owed this much, this weighed heavily upon them. If Jesus were telling us today, he would say this king was approached by a subject who owed him $3.5 billion. But since, verse 25, he did not have the means to repay, any of you got an extra $3.5 billion to help repay? I could use a little help. He didn't have the means to repay. His Lord commanded him to be sold along with his wife and children and all that he had, and repayment to be made. The king looked at him and said, I think you and your wife and your children, your possessions, that will do. Not worth $3.5 billion, but it's the most I can do. So the slave fell to the ground and prostrated himself before him, saying, have patience with me, and I'll repay you everything. Could he really repay $3.5 billion? He's desperate. Just be paid. Don't sell it. I'll do anything. Verse 27. The Lord of that slave felt compassion and released him and forgave the debt. There's no way he can ever repay this. And yet he's begging for the opportunity to repay it. And the Lord has compassion on him and says, you know what? Paid in full. It would be helpful if any of you in the room had ever had a $3.5 billion debt, because then you could come explain what that feels like to have $3.5 billion forgiven. I don't think any of you have. But can you imagine the weight of knowing you owed $3.5 billion? And then the IRS or the county or the state or whomever looks at you and says, it's paid in full. That would be quite a relief. Jesus says that's what the kingdom is like. Is that when you come into the kingdom, your entrance, and he's going to describe that entrance with the parable of the feast in chapter 22. It is that you've been invited, not that you're worthy. And when you come to the banquet, you put on the clothing provided by the king, not your own righteousness, not your own effort. You come because Jesus makes the way. That's how you get into the kingdom. And he says, once you realize that you've been forgiven this debt that you could never pay, you recognize the wealth of the kingdom.